I shall start off by introducing Emma. Emma didn't apply to read English at the Hall. It's a good start, isn't it? She applied to Exeter College, and she was one of those people that we managed to poach. There's another such in the audience, but I won't mention that just now. And I know that the Exeter team, the Exeter Fellows, have been kicking themselves ever since, and are full of pique because they've seen this astonishing, stellar career. She came up to the Hall in 1994 and just kind of powered her way through her studies, at the same time sustaining a brilliant journalist career. She became editor of Cherwell. She won the Philip Geddes Journalism Prize, and she graduated with a first. Since then, she's been recognised by the British Press Awards 3 times. So she got the Young Journalist of the Year Award in 2001, the Feature Writer of the Year Award in 2002, and she was again nominated for that in 2006. And then, more recently, you'll all know her, I'm sure, as a writer for the Guardian. More recently, she's been experimenting with a very different kind of writing. She's been writing memoirs. And her first book, What Would Barbara Do, was a musical memoir published in 2007, which won many accolades. The New York Times reviewer said, and you'll know this one, if I could offer Brox any advice, it would be to write as many books on as many subjects as she can, as fast as is reasonably possible. It's great. So, pretty fast. This is the next one. She Left Me the Gun, My Mother's Life Before Me, and it will be published in the spring.
Yes.
Where's the spring? How soon?
It's April 3rd.
April the 3rd. Okay. And I'm lucky enough to have the galleys, and I've got 20 pages into this, and it is absolutely uncategorisable. It is a kind of mixture of humour, very, very funny, but also it is full of dread. There is a story here which is extremely disturbing and frightening. So read on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I'm very happy to be back here in Teddy Hall. I haven't been back for many years. I thought I might have an anxious reaction to wandering around Oxford, but actually it's been very nice. So I thought I would talk a bit about journalism and a bit about book writing and a lot about digital and how to have what is probably now called by careers consultants a holistic approach to combining all three, which is what you have to do. But actually, when I think about it, it just means how to get through your day without being distracted by Twitter. So it's 20 years since I matriculated, and in media terms, this is how long ago that was. Half of us still wrote our essays out longhand then. Some people had personal computers, but they weren't connected to anything. There was a computer room in college, which at that time was populated mainly by international students who would emerge at odd hours of the day or night with big eyes because they had been doing something called sending an email. When I was editor of Cherwell, the paper was produced every week by one of us taking the output pages and physically getting on a bus to an industrial estate outside Bicester to hand it to the printer in person. And actually, I don't have dreams where I wake up sweating about finals. It's about that bus to Bicester. So when people say the media landscape is harder these days than it was, I think it could be worse. When I joined The Guardian in 1998, this is how long ago it was, copy takers still existed. That department which, if you found yourself in a field in Somerset or anywhere where there wasn't a dial-up connection, you had to ring an office, a call centre, in fact, where you would read your story down the phone and the woman at the other end might offer you such encouragement as, is there much more of this to come? The Guardian's online department, when I joined the newspaper, consisted of 15 people, roughly. most of whom walked around the office in their socks. It was in a loft conversion opposite the main building, quarantined because it was seen to be such an unserious endeavour. And most of the people who worked there were assumed to have backed the wrong horse. They were deviants who weren't going anywhere fast. So cut to now, and The Guardian's New York office alone has 60 people in it working on the US digital edition of the newspaper. And all of us, anyone who works in any media, is required to file across all platforms, print and digital, which I think has a lot of interesting implications on how you write, how you move between the different mediums, how storytelling conventions have changed to accommodate the new technology. I think there was a lot of alarmism in the early days of blogging and Twitter especially, that all of this spelled the death of long-form journalism, that no one had any attention span anymore, that the funding model didn't work because it's very time-consuming and expensive to produce this kind of journalism compared to shorter forms like blogging, all of that. Actually, what I think seems to be happening right now is that the appetite for the well-researched and considered magazine piece has, if anything, increased as a refuge from the noise and the sugar rush of the thousands of daily blogs which we are also consuming. And I think, as a consumer of media, which we all are now, that one's digestive process needs a more complex protein to function. I also think that analogy needed another 5 minutes, but you see what I mean. That it's not enough just to be rising up off the news every morning and getting your 500-word fix. You do occasionally need something bigger and longer. A recent example of this is Zoe Heller's takedown of Salman Rushdie in the New York Review of Books, which got huge traction over here and in the US, was a very long, meticulously assembled, painstaking critique of him, endlessly blogged about on both sides of the Atlantic, and I think was far, far more visible for being precisely the kind of thing that the daily churn of online journalism just doesn't do. That's from the point of view of the reader. I think for the writer, it's slightly different and slightly more complicated. So I write long pieces for The Guardian weekend magazine. I blog twice weekly, or I am contracted to blog twice weekly for the US site. I'm on Twitter, and I have a book coming out. And all of these things cross-promote and cross-inform each other at a marketing level. And also, more interestingly, I think, on a stylistic level. On the marketing point, I read something very interesting the other day on a website called Snark Market by a guy called Robin Sloan, who is an economics graduate in the US and who chooses to think of his writing career in economics terms. So he talks about something called stock and flow, which, if any of you are economics students, you will recognise instantly. So it's his contention that your flow as a writer in this day and age is your daily output that reminds people in a very crowded marketplace that you exist. So that's your tweeting, your blogging, your quick turnaround pieces. And your stock is the book that you're writing, or the long piece that you're working on, or the thing that presumably made you want to go into that line of work in the first place. Now, unless you are incredibly successful, it's very hard to have stock without flow these days, because you have to draw attention to your main event. And I think that's quite a helpful way of looking at it. You just have to get the balance right. That's the difficulty. You are endlessly distracted from the main task, but you can't ignore these other distractions altogether. Some of it, I think, depends on what kind of a writing brain you have. So the novelist Jonathan Franzen famously says that no good novels are produced at a computer with an internet connection. And apparently to that end, Franzen actually put chewing gum in the USB port of his computer. Now, if you're someone who can do that and produce the next great American novel, then that's great. If, like me, you've sort of grown up in daily journalism and have an attention span of about 3 minutes, the internet isn't necessarily a problem if you're disciplined about it. I think it can be quite motivating and actually quite helpful in a writing career. The only thing I remember from GCSE geography is the theory of the three-field system, right? Which was that if you plant the same crops over and over in the same field, you exhaust the nutrients of that field. And it feels to me sometimes like that's what a writing career is like, that if you carry on, you know, hammering the same format over and over again, you deplete your resources relatively quickly. There is something very energizing about moving between short, hyper short, and long form types of writing, so that when one is driving you crazy, you can repair to another and refresh yourself. And actually, I think a similar philosophy is true in life generally, which is that if there is something that you don't want to do, the trick is to find something that you want to do even less, and then you oscillate between the two. And the two things I always use for this, where I've never actually done it, is schedule an unnecessary eye operation, or start reading Jean Fowles's The Magus. And then everything else in your life just looks easy if you have those two things on your slate. So, in my case, when you've done as many 3,500 word celebrity interviews as I have done, when all the actresses start to look the same, when you're completely format bound and burnt out, and you find yourself doing the kind of shorthand tricks that you swore you would never do, like quoting what they said to the waiter, as if it represents a big insight into their character. I think then it's quite healthy to resharpen by going and doing something else, writing a blog, going back to the book that you've been working on for 5 years, anything just to get away from the format you've become so bound to. The question at this point, then, I think, is how do the different approaches relate to each other? It's still very early days in terms of online journalism, and blogging is a newish format. And the term itself covers a huge range of things, from a two-line joke attached to a photo of Lindsay Lohan on Gawker, to a 900-word political analysis that could just as easily run in the newspaper. I think if there is a difference, the main difference is tonal. So even the most serious blogs tend to have a more dashed-off, colloquial feel. There's greater use of the first person. There's a fresher, faster, less considered style. And I mean that in a good way. I think a blog is supposed to be the start of a conversation more than an opinion handed down from on high. You have your say, you leave the room, the people in the comment section beneath your article then tell you that everything you say is completely wrong, and always has been and always will be. But it's a much livelier format. The other thing is, it's a small thing, but there are protocol differences at this point, I think, which is that online everyone pretends now to be in this kind of post-competitive environment. So if I write a blog for The Guardian and I mention someone's piece from a rival publication, I am obliged, out of politeness, to link to it. Whereas on the page, if I was writing in the magazine, you still discreetly present information gathered from other publications as if it fell out of the sky onto your lap. So I did this last week. I had an interview with Charlie Sheen, and I wanted to use some comments that his brother, Emilio Estevez, had made to The Telegraph in relation to their father. And if I'd been writing online, I would have given full attribution to The Telegraph, but somehow in the magazine it still looked extremely odd. It's not what the protocol is. So all of these things are sort of being renegotiated at the moment, and subtly change the way in which you approach each piece you write according to where it's going to be published. I was trying to figure out whether digital journalism has changed the way in which traditional magazine writing works, and I think it probably has a little bit. Everything is a little bit more first person now, since if you write across multiple media, as you are obliged to do, the common denominator is you. You are the brand. And that's why in some ways it's a great time to be going into journalism. The writer has more power now than he or she ever did. It's much easier to get published now than it was when I started out. If I was graduating now, I would have many more outlets for my work. I would be able to, for free, set up my own blog, and if it worked, establish a readership before trying to get picked up by a bigger organisation. All of which is very encouraging and good, I think, although the problem is getting someone to pay for it. But the opportunities are out there, I think. There are things that haven't changed. I think the basic principles of good writing are consistent across all forms, and that a background in journalistic training is as relevant now as it ever was. In fact, it's probably more relevant because the competition is so fierce these days. So Long-form non-fiction will teach you how to manage the interplay between front story and back story, how to tread the fine line between the two big journalistic pitfalls and the pitfalls of writing generally, which are either blowing your punchline too far up the story, which is the "they came for the old woman at dawn" model, and tends to result in a very feverish, overblown kind of style that you see in some foreign reporting sometimes. And its opposite, the burying the lead far too down the story. I have a friend who teaches at a journalism school in New York, quite a high-end school, and she says that a lot of her students who are given as set texts, Joan Didion, Tom Wolfe, Janet Malcolm, all of the big guns of American non-fiction, they have a bias against what they see as tabloid writing. So this has its own problems. When she recently set them an exercise to do a news story about a fire in the faculty building, a lot of her students didn't get to the actual fire until the 7th paragraph. Because as they saw it, they were setting the scene. So they described the outside of the building, the stairs going up the building. And you see this when novelists file a piece to The Guardian or to a magazine, which they, if it's thought to be an issue of great national importance, they are occasionally asked to do. And you always have to cut through 3 pages of throat clearing until you get to the actual point. So I think a tabloid or a news desk training is an extremely good antidote to this, no matter what kind of writer you want to be. It teaches you to identify the story. It teaches you to do what good writing should do, which is to have the maximum impact in the least number of words. It teaches you sneaky tricks as well, which come in very handy when you're short of time, like how little of a point you need in order to make it look as if you have a point. This always makes me think of something that happened at Oxford, which I remind myself of frequently. It was a tutorial at a different college, and I remember I read out my essay and sat there moved by my own eloquence. and this particular tutor, there was a long pause, and she said, "So what?" Which is probably the hardest critique I've ever got. But it's a useful thing to ask yourself when you're writing anything, like, so what? You don't have to have much, but you have to have something. At the same time, I think, you don't have to come to a conclusion. There was an editor we had at The Guardian a few years ago who has now left, who used to torment us every time we came back from doing a celebrity interview. You would file your piece, and the word would come back, "Oh, it's okay, but what's your thesis?" She always insisted that you had a thesis. Now, I don't know if you can have a thesis about Russell Crowe's personality, but if you can, it's probably not one I'm going to spend a lot of time thinking about. All of these things are just different ways of telling a story at the end of the day, and every single one of them thinks it has the monopoly on truth. So news writers think that fact is truth. Feature writers think that nuance and ambiguity is truth. Fiction writers obviously think that fiction is truth. And I think bloggers think that radical transparency and a certain unadorned opinion is truth. And everyone is right. It's just a question of how you choose to look at it and where you want to train your efforts. So, as Lucy said, I just wrote a memoir. It took an inordinately long time because I had a simultaneous need to break off every couple of hours to write a 500-word blog about Beyoncé or whatever I was doing. But operating on the 3-field system approach, I think it would have taken even longer if I didn't have other refuges to go and hide out in when it was really killing my brain. It's an interesting thing to work in daily journalism and then try and write something longer than about 5,000 words. When you do that, your agents will inevitably try and take the pressure off you by saying things like, "Just do what you do in the magazine, but longer." And they have good reason for saying this, good psychological reason for saying this, because you have spent years establishing a consistent tone of voice for yourself in whatever publication you work for. And then you sit down to write a book, and I think especially if you've done English here, you have this idea that you have to sort of ventriloquise Thomas Hardy or George Eliot, that there is a special pompous voice that you have to put on for writing a book with a capital B. and it ruins your style. Everything that you were that got you the publishing deal in the first place, you blow out of the water, and it takes your book editors a long time to talk you back into your old self. But at the same time, saying do what you do in the magazine but longer also doesn't really make sense. You can keep your tone of voice just, but everything else that you've learned if you've worked as a journalist has to be undone. When you're a journalist, you're trying to crunch a huge amount of information down into a capsule to fit it into the space. When you start writing a book, it's the opposite. You're trying to oxygenate your prose so that the dramatic events don't fall too close together, so that you can establish a sense of time passing without it feeling like you're treading water, and so that you can give yourself space to go off on diversions without losing the surface tension that keeps people reading. And it was my experience, at least, that all of this took a very long time to figure out. My book editor at Faber said something useful to me when I was starting out, and I sent her some pages. She said, "You need more chairs and tables." And it's the stuff that a newspaper editor strips out instantly. What in newspaper terms is seen to be self-indulgent, but which in book terms is completely essential. And I think it's even worse for novelists. I have a writer friend who is a very successful non-fiction writer, and who won't go into novels, he says, because he can't bear to write the sentence, "He opened the car door and got out." And the other thing is, if you come from journalism and you go into memoir writing, it's also totally counterintuitive. Even though you're using the first person more frequently now in blogs, it's really not the same thing as introducing yourself as a character over the course of 90,000 words. It breaks every rule that's been pounded into your head since you first joined a newspaper. To the extent that when I filed the first draft of this book, my US editor read it, took me out to lunch and said, "You've achieved something quite remarkable." And I preened over the sushi. And she said, "Yes, you've managed to write a memoir in which you reveal almost nothing of yourself." So I did explain to her that there was only so much I could do with my personality, but that I would go and have another go. In spite of that, I still think the most effective writing is short and compressed, and that you cut away until you can cut away no more. I was writing about highly dramatic events in my mother's life, briefly. When she was dying, she told me that she'd had her father arrested and convicted for child abuse, which was no mean feat in 1950 South Africa, and it was something she'd never told me before. So after her death, I flew to Johannesburg for the first time to meet all of her relatives and to interview them, and to try and extract the story both from them and from paperwork in the National Archive in Pretoria. So the book has a lot of absurdly dramatic scenes to get in because, among other things, her father turned out to be a convicted murderer as well as an enthusiastic child molester. And I discovered that the gun my mother kept in the house where I was growing up had on occasion been used. This is an example of burying the lead, by the way. So tone was an issue in this book. I was vehemently against writing a book that would wind up in the miserable lives section of Waterstones. The only reason to write it, I thought, was that apart from the fact that it's a great story, it runs counter to the thriving abuse-based section of the publishing industry, which takes a certain voyeuristic delight in serving up grim stories, grimly told. So I wanted to tell a relatively grim story, but I wanted to tell it in a different way. I wanted it to be in keeping with my mother's high levels of delight and success, in spite of everything, in being a very happy and productive person. So I came to think of it as an anti-misery memoir, if you like. And to give you an idea of just how hostile I am to the other kinds, the working title of the book was Boo Fucking Who. But it was a tricky thing to pull off. You're trying to be funny about extremely unfunny material. You are trying to be sharp without being glib. You're trying to move between light and dark without losing consistency of tone. Didion, again, is a very useful model here, as is my late friend Nora Ephron, who actually came up with the title for me, the real title. both of them understood, I think, that the lower the surface temperature of your prose, the higher the emotional voltage it can carry. That was the approach that I decided to take. So the actual title ended up being She Left Me the Gun, and it is a hybrid form. It's a combination of journalism and memoir. It's a love story. It's a story that I think also mirrors some aspects of the writing experience, in that it asks if it's better to know a thing than to not know a thing. It asks how much information is enough to allow you to move on, as they say, which I think has a parallel in writing. How much is too much is the constant question you're asking yourself as you write. Overkill versus being too oblique. And trying to figure out how to allow yourself the space to not know where you're going with something until you get there. And I think this is something that fiction writers think about more than non-fiction writers, but this idea that writing with no destination in mind allows their subconscious some measure of freedom. So I think the art of not knowing is a valuable one indeed. In my case, I'm a very big fan of denial. If I could, in this situation, have gotten away with not knowing anything, I would have probably opted for that. But the problem is, if you know you're in denial, then you're not really in denial. So in the end, I gave up and resigned myself to finding out everything. And then it's just a question of setting it down as clearly and efficiently as you can, so that everybody can pack up and go home. I think it's no grander than that. I think far too many mystical properties are attributed to the act of writing, and most of it is just to flatter the writer and to excuse her procrastination. I think for anyone who is an undergraduate right now, I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be starting a career in journalism, online, in any of the formats. And if people tell you otherwise, which they will, I think you must resist them. I think it can be hard, and I think it can be frustrating, but whether you're blogging or writing a piece or slaving for 5 years over a book, I think when you do get it right, it is profoundly satisfying. And if you don't get it right the first 10 times, then honestly, boo fucking who. I think you have to come back the next day and try again.